The train was late that evening. Sarah sat by the window, her reflection dancing on the glass, merging with the fading countryside. Her headphones were in, but no music played, just silence, the kind that buzzes in your ears when your thoughts are too loud. She was exhausted. Not just from the long week, or the city's weight, but from something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. As the train rolled forward, she looked across the aisle and noticed him. An older man, well-dressed but not flashy, reading a worn-out leather journal. There was something oddly familiar about him, though she was sure she'd never seen him before. Then it happened. He looked up, met her eyes, and offered a slight, knowing smile. Not flirtatious, not forced, just knowing. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. Something about the way he looked at her made her stomach tighten. She turned back to the window. But then he spoke. Quietly. "You always bite your thumbnail when you're nervous." Her heart stopped. She hadn't done that since she was a teenager. Her mind raced. Had he been watching her? Was he some kind of stalker? "Excuse me," she said, trying to mask the tremor in her voice. "You used to do that," he replied gently, "in high school. Especially before exams." Her blood ran cold. He couldn't know that. No one could. Not here. Not now. "Who are you?" she demanded, voice low and sharp. He closed the journal and folded his hands calmly. "I'll explain. But not here. Not yet." The train lights flickered, and the landscape outside dissolved into darkness. Sarah's pulse quickened. She didn't know whether to run, call for help, or keep listening. But one thing was certain. This man knew something. Something only she should know. Sarah sat rigid in her seat, every instinct screaming for her to move, to demand answers, to escape. But something kept her grounded. It wasn't just fear. It was curiosity, laced with a strange sense of familiarity. The man across from her didn't look threatening. In fact, his eyes held a calm she hadn't seen in years. "You don't remember me," he said, not as a question, but as a quiet resignation. "No? Should I?" she replied. Her voice was steadier than she expected. He nodded slightly. "We met once. You were 6. I was much younger then. Different." Sarah's mind tried to match his face with the hundreds she'd known over the years. Nothing. "My name is Elias," he said. That name hit something inside her. A faint bell from a dream long forgotten. "I used to know your mother." Sarah's breath caught. Her mother had died when she was a child. Few people even remembered her. "You knew her how?" she asked, almost whispering. Elias looked down at the journal in his lap. "I loved her, a long time ago, before she left. Before everything fell apart." Her chest tightened. Her mother never spoke of her past. Elias continued. "She wrote letters she never sent. Pages filled with words for you. For the life she wished she could have given. I have them." He reached into his bag and pulled out a bundle of yellowed envelopes, tied with a red ribbon. Sarah stared at them, her hands frozen. A flood of emotion washed over her: grief, confusion, anger, longing. Who was this man? Why did he have letters from a woman Sarah barely remembered? And why now, after all these years, was he here, bringing the past with him? The envelope in her hand felt heavier than it should. Sarah stared at the handwriting. Familiar, delicate and haunting, her mother's script. She hadn't seen it in decades, but the curves of each letter struck something deep. She looked up at Elias, who simply nodded, encouraging her. With trembling fingers, she untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. It began, "My dear Sarah." Tears welled in her eyes before she even read the second line. Her mother's voice, long buried in silence, was speaking again. The letter wasn't dramatic. It was simple. It spoke of regret, of moments missed, of lullabies never sung, of watching from afar. Sarah stopped reading and looked at Elias, her voice cracked. "You said she left, but she died when I was a child." Elias's eyes softened. "That's what they told you." But it's not the whole truth. The train jolted slightly, pulling her back to the present. The world was still moving, though everything inside her felt paused. She didn't abandon you, Elias continued. She was forced to leave. There were reasons. Things she never had the chance to explain. Sarah's heart pounded. Memories she had buried began surfacing. Fights behind closed doors, whispers, a scent that vanished too soon. "Why now?" she asked, her voice almost breaking. "Why find me after all these years?" Elias hesitated. "Because I made a promise. To her. That one day, when you were ready, I would find you and give you these letters." Sarah looked at the pile in her lap, pages of love and sorrow sealed by time. "She watched you grow from a distance," Elias said. "Every birthday, every achievement, every heartbreak, you were never alone, even when you thought you were." Sarah pressed the letter to her chest. Her world was cracking open, not with chaos, but with truth. Painful, beautiful truth. The train hummed along the tracks as Sarah sat emotionless, overwhelmed by the flood of revelations. Elias placed the remaining letters gently on the table between them. "There's one you need to read next," he said softly, pulling a smaller envelope from his coat pocket. It was dated 3 months before her mother's supposed death. Sarah opened it with care, her eyes scanning the lines as her hands trembled. The letter described a hidden truth. Her mother had been pregnant when she left, not just with Sarah, but with a second child, a twin. The words hit her like a tidal wave. "You were born together," the letter read, "but I could only keep one of you." Sarah looked up, stunned. "I had a twin?" Elias nodded. "A boy. He was taken by your father's family, separated at birth. Your mother wasn't allowed to raise both of you." Sarah's voice cracked. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" "Because the people around you thought it would be easier," Elias replied. "They thought protecting you meant hiding the truth." Her chest tightened with a grief she didn't know how to process. She had lived an entire life feeling half empty, without ever knowing why. Suddenly, memories began to make sense. Those dreams of someone calling her name, the feeling of not being alone in her own thoughts. "Where is he now?" she asked, eyes searching Elias for answers. He hesitated. "That's why I'm here. He's been searching for you too." The world around her faded into a blur. Her hands clutched the letter tighter, as tears streamed down her face. For years she believed her story was one of abandonment. Now she realized it was one of separation and reunion. "He's alive," she whispered. Elias nodded solemnly. "And he's waiting for you, just like your mother did." Sarah's heart raced, not with fear, but with a spark of something long buried, hope. Sarah barely noticed the passing landscape outside the train window. Her entire reality had shifted. A twin brother. A life that had run parallel to hers, hidden just beneath the surface of her existence. Elias watched her carefully, understanding the weight of the truth he had just delivered. "His name is Samuel," he said gently. "He grew up only a few towns away from you. Different schools, different paths, but always wondering." Sarah's mind flashed through her childhood, trying to recall faces she might have seen, voices that might have felt too familiar. "He reached out to me a year ago," Elias continued. "He had found an old diary from your mother. It led him to the letters, and eventually to me." Sarah turned toward Elias, a question trembling on her lips. "Why didn't he just contact me directly?" Elias paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because he didn't want to break your world without preparing you. He wanted to make sure you were ready. That's what your mother asked in her final letters, to let you find your way to him, not the other way around." Sarah felt a strange mix of heartbreak and gratitude. This brother, Samuel, had waited in the shadows of her life, respecting a wish he could have easily ignored. "He sent me something," Elias said, reaching into his coat again. From a worn envelope, he pulled out a photograph. 2 children, no more than 4 or 5, sitting beside each other on a park bench. Identical smiles, identical eyes. Sarah's breath caught. She recognized herself, and beside her, a boy she had never truly known. Her hands shook as she held the picture. "This was us," Elias nodded. "A rare moment. Your mother kept it hidden, afraid it would raise questions." The emotional weight in her chest deepened. She had spent her whole life looking for pieces of herself, in memories, in places, in faces. And now, here he was, a missing half, quietly waiting to be found. Sarah stared at the photo, her fingers trembling as they traced the edges. Her world had always felt slightly tilted, as if something fundamental had been missing. Now she understood why. Elias gave her a moment of silence, letting the gravity of the moment settle into her bones. "Your brother wants to meet you," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "He's been waiting at the station cafe. He didn't want to overwhelm you. He said, if you didn't come, he would understand." The words hit her harder than she expected. A lifetime of wondering, and the answer was sitting just a few steps away waiting. "And what if I don't know what to say?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elias smiled softly. "Then don't say anything, just be there. Sometimes presence is louder than words." The train began to slow as the station came into view, its structure bathed in the golden hue of late afternoon. The silence between them was filled with tension and anticipation. As the train rolled to a stop, Sarah stood slowly, the photograph still clutched in her hand. Her legs felt heavy, her breath uneven, but she moved forward. On the platform, the world seemed to pause. She scanned the crowd, her eyes darting past strangers, searching for something she had never seen but somehow knew. And then, there he was, sitting alone at a corner table, head lowered, fingers fidgeting with a paper cup. Her heart raced. She took a cautious step forward, then another. He looked up, their eyes met. And in that instant, time bent around them. No words, no explanations, just two souls, torn apart by fate, reunited by truth. A tear slipped down her cheek as she walked toward him. He stood slowly, uncertainty in his movements. She reached out, gently placing the photograph between them on the table. "Is this real?" she asked, voice cracking. Samuel's eyes filled with tears. "It always has been. We just didn't know." And in that quiet, sacred moment, the years melted away. Two halves, finally made whole. They sat in silence for several minutes, the kind of silence that wasn't awkward but sacred. Samuel's hands shook as he held the photograph. Sarah had handed him, his thumbs brushing over the edges, as if trying to memorize its texture. "I've had this picture since I was tenente," he finally said, his voice raw. "I didn't know your name. I didn't know where you were. But I knew you existed." Sarah felt something deep inside her shift, like a lock turning for the first time in years. "I thought I was alone," she whispered. "I always felt misplaced." Samuel nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "Me too. All my life I've searched. Foster homes, institutions, records that led nowhere. But then Elias found me. He said he was helping someone else. That someone was you." A sharp breath escaped her lips. Elias had known this entire time. He had orchestrated their reunion. "He never told me the full story," she murmured. "Just hints. Pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know I was trying to solve." Samuel smiled sadly. Maybe he believed the truth would hit harder if you discovered it yourself. Sometimes answers aren't given, they're found. A waitress approached their table, asking if they wanted anything. They both declined. Food felt meaningless right now. All that mattered was this fragile, miraculous moment. "Do you remember anything from before?" Sarah asked gently. "A sound, a smell, anything?" Samuel closed his eyes. "Laughter, a woman's laughter, and the scent of vanilla. I used to dream about it, that, and the sound of a train." Sarah's eyes welled up. "Our mother wore vanilla perfume. I remember it too." Time collapsed. Two stories, once fragmented, were now being stitched together with every memory, every shared ache. Sarah reached across the table and placed her hand over his. He flinched at first, then relaxed. "We can start again," she said, her voice firm this time. "We may have lost the past, but we don't have to lose the future." Samuel nodded. "I'd like that." Outside the window, a train pulled away from the platform, its echo fading into the horizon, just as a new journey quietly began inside that small café. The following days felt surreal. Sarah and Samuel began spending hours together, exploring not only the city, but the memories buried deep within themselves. They visited the orphanage where Samuel had spent most of his childhood. It was now a shelter, repainted and rebranded, but the walls still whispered echoes of what once was. "This used to be my room," Samuel pointed to a narrow hallway. "Second bed on the left. I used to stare at the ceiling and pretend the cracks were maps leading me to someone, to you." Sarah stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the idea that her brother had lived so close to her pain, yet so far from her world. "I was only a few neighborhoods away," she said. "We could have passed each other on the street and never known." The weight of that possibility made them both fall silent. Later that evening they sat at Sarah's apartment, sifting through boxes of old belongings their mother had left behind. Most of the items were mundane: kitchenware, letters, faded photographs, but then Sarah found a diary. The leather was cracked, and the pages yellowed, but her mother's handwriting was unmistakable. "Do you want to read it?" she asked Samuel. He hesitated, then nodded. Page by page, they uncovered entries full of grief, guilt, and longing. Their mother had written about giving them up to protect them, from a violent relationship, from poverty, from a life she couldn't control. "I thought I'd find them when things got better," one entry read. "But time slipped away, and shame kept me prisoner." Samuel clutched the book tightly. "She never stopped thinking about us," he murmured. Sarah nodded, tears streaking her cheeks. "And she wanted us to find each other. That's why she kept these." The discovery of the diary didn't erase the years of pain, but it rewrote the narrative. Their story wasn't just about loss, it was about survival, sacrifice, and perhaps forgiveness. That night, they sat in silence again, this time not from fear or sadness, but from reverence. Two souls, once broken and scattered, were slowly becoming whole again, through truth, through shared history, and through the quiet, powerful act of remembering. The following morning, Sarah and Samuel stood at the cemetery gates, holding a bouquet of white lilies. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and the quiet weight of remembrance. They walked side by side, until they reached their mother's grave. Unadorned, quiet, almost forgotten. "She died alone," Sarah whispered, kneeling. "But maybe she didn't want to be found." Samuel placed the flowers gently at the base of the headstone. "Or maybe she didn't know how to be found." They stood there for a long time, saying nothing. It wasn't sadness that filled the silence now, it was understanding. They weren't mourning a stranger anymore. They were honoring a woman who had made the hardest choices imaginable. As they turned to leave, an old caretaker approached. "You her children?" he asked, adjusting his capiton. They nodded. The man pulled a small envelope from his jacket pocket. "She asked me to give this to you, if you ever came." Sarah opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper, aged and fragile. It read, "To my children, if you're reading this, it means you found each other. That was my hope. That my silence wouldn't be the end of your story, but the beginning of a new one. I loved you both more than life itself. I'm sorry I didn't know how to show it. Love, Mom." Samuel's knees gave out, and he sat on the grass, head in his hands. Sarah crouched beside him, the letter clutched to her chest. The words were simple, but they shattered the last wall between them and the woman who had been a ghost in their lives. It was a final act of courage from a mother who had once vanished to protect them. It didn't justify everything, but it meant everything. That afternoon, back at Sarah's apartment, they lit a candle for her. No words. Just firelight and memory. And for the first time, their grief felt complete, not because it had ended, but because it had finally been seen. In that quiet glow, they weren't just survivors of abandonment. They were the children of a woman who tried, who failed, who loved, and who, in her final act, gave them back to each other. The days that followed were strange and sacred. Samuel stayed at Sarah's apartment, and the two siblings, once strangers, began to relearn each other, not through stories of the past, but through quiet breakfasts, shared silences, and the occasional outburst of laughter that neither expected. It wasn't perfect. Samuel struggled with guilt over the life he lived, the years lost. Sarah wrestled with anger that surfaced in waves, unpredictable and sharp. But through it all, they stayed. One evening, Sarah brought out an old shoebox of letters she had written but never sent. Pages filled with longing, confusion, and desperate questions she once had for the mother who disappeared. "You were writing to a ghost," Samuel said softly. "I was trying to keep her alive," Sarah replied. He picked up one of the letters, his eyes scanning the ink-stained pain of his sister's childhood. "She'd want to know you held on," he whispered. "Even when she couldn't." That night, they sat on the floor, reading aloud the words Sarah had once buried, letting each syllable peel away another layer of hurt. It was like digging up a time capsule of grief and healing. Later, Samuel pulled out something of his own, a small music box, worn and cracked. "She gave me this, the day she left. Said I'd understand one day." He opened it. The melody was broken, distorted with age. But it played. And as it did, Sarah's eyes filled with tears, not because the tune was familiar, but because the act was. She had once heard that melody in her dreams, the same fragmented notes that had haunted her childhood. "I thought I made it up," she said. "I think she left pieces of herself with both of us," Samuel replied. "Like echoes, waiting to be found." In that moment, they weren't trying to fix the past. They were building something new, with its cracks, yes, but also with its music. And in the quiet between each note, they heard something they had missed for years: belonging. The next morning, the sky outside was painted in shades of gray and gold, as if the world itself was in quiet reflection. Sarah brewed coffee while Samuel stood by the window watching the city begin its day. "You ever wonder if she knew what she was doing?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel didn't answer right away. He simply nodded. "I think she hoped for the best, feared the worst, and disappeared in between. They didn't need to say more." Some questions don't have clean answers, only truths that live in fragments. Later that day, they visited the place where their mother was buried, a modest grave with a simple inscription: "Gone, but not forgotten." Sarah knelt down and placed a letter on the headstone. It wasn't long, just a page filled with words she once screamed into pillows and buried in journals. "I forgive you" was how it ended. Samuel placed the music box beside it, letting the silence of the cemetery hold its broken tune. As they stood there side by side, strangers no more, Sarah felt something shift, not closure but peace. A quiet understanding that healing wasn't about erasing pain, but making space for it to exist without owning you. "What now?" Samuel asked, as they walked back to the car. Sarah smiled, not because she knew the answer, but because the question no longer scared her. "We live," she said. "We keep showing up. We make new stories." That night, she started writing again. Not to ghosts, not to questions, but to life, to everything ahead. And for the first time, her words didn't echo, they landed. Weeks passed, and life began to settle into something that resembled normal. But normal didn't mean forgetfulness, it meant carrying the past with grace. Sarah found herself writing every day, not to escape but to understand. Her journal filled with thoughts she no longer needed to bury, with letters not of grief, but of gratitude. One morning, she received a small package in the mail. No sender. Inside, a single photograph, her mother, younger, laughing beside a man Sarah didn't recognize. On the back, scribbled in faint ink, it read, "I was happy once, I hope you'll find that too." Sarah pressed the photo to her heart. It was a strange gift, arriving so late and from nowhere. But somehow, it made perfect sense. She knew she'd never get all the answers. Some pieces of the story would always remain hidden, scattered in time. But what mattered now wasn't the past, it was what she chose to do with it. That night, she uploaded her first story to a blog titled, "Letters That Found Me." She didn't expect readers, she wrote because it healed her. But slowly, comments began to appear. Others who had lost, who had searched, who had found pieces of themselves in silence. Her pain had become purpose, her story, a mirror. And as Sarah sat in the quiet of her apartment, a candle flickering on her desk, she whispered to no one and everyone at once. "You were never really gone, you just waited for me to find you." And in that, she found herself.